Wade Tanner's fist closed around Sadie Coleman's hair before she could set the needle down. He dragged her out of the chair, the machine still buzzing on the floor. He forced her down onto her knees in front of every customer in that shop, in front of a stranger with half a tattoo still bleeding on his arm, and said one thing, cold and flat: "Your mother's debt doesn't forgive itself." Wade dropped a folded paper in front of her knees, a wage garnishment agreement, missing only her signature. He picked the buzzing needle off the floor, held it an inch from her cheek, and told her to sign it right there or leave that shop looking worse than broke. The old woman behind the counter didn't move. 67 years old, gray hair pulled back tight, hands marked with old scars that had nothing to do with ink. She had one choice: stay still and let him finish, or reach for something she'd promised herself she'd left behind for good. What Wade Tanner didn't know was who he'd just walked in on. A long time ago, other bikers used to fear her name. Nobody in that shop had the first idea what was about to happen or why. A man like Wade Tanner should never have raised that needle in her house. Stay with us, because within the hour, 300 Hells Angels shut down every road leading out of that town. This is Heart Tales. Now let's find out what happened that day. Carol Gunmore set her own needle down on a folded towel the way she'd set down 10,000 needles before it, and walked across the shop floor like she had all the time left in the world. She didn't raise her voice. She reached out, took Wade's wrist, and turned it. Not hard, not fast, just exact, until the needle dropped from his fingers and the wage garnishment fell face down on the concrete beside Sadie's knees. Wade stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. One of the two men he'd brought with him moved toward Carol from the side. She stepped into him instead of away, drove her palm into his sternum, and put him on the floor between the waiting chairs before he understood what had happened to his balance. The shop went quiet in a different way than before. Wade straightened his jacket. He looked at the man on the floor, then at Carol, and laughed, short and humorless. The laugh of a man deciding the last 30 seconds hadn't really happened. "Lady, you don't know who you're dealing with," he said. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Carol said. "You're a man who gets paid to scare women in front of their own family. I've met plenty of you." Wade's hand went to his waistband. The knife he pulled wasn't large, but it was enough to change the temperature of the room. Sadie, still on her knees, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Carol didn't step back. "Put it away and walk out that door right now," she said. "I'll forget your name by morning. That's the only offer you're going to get from me." Ask yourself what you would have done in that half second if you'd been the one holding the knife, looking at a 67-year-old woman who hadn't so much as raised her voice. For half a second, something in Wade's face flickered. The kind of hesitation a smarter man would have followed. Sadie, still on her knees, watched that flicker happen, and for one heartbeat let herself believe this might end without anyone else getting hurt. Then his jaw set, and the flicker closed over. "I don't take orders from tattoo shop grandmas," he said, and stepped toward Sadie again, knife low at his side, like he intended to finish what he'd started, whether Carol liked it or not. That was the second Earl Whitfield stood up out of the tattoo chair, ink still wet and unfinished on his forearm, and put himself between Wade and the two women, without a word. Wade looked at the old man, at the faded ring of scar tissue along his knuckles, and laughed again, thinner this time. "Sit back down, old-timer. This isn't your fight." "Son," Earl said, quiet enough that the whole shop had to lean in to hear, "you have got no idea whose needle just touched your neck an hour ago in that chair, and you have got even less idea whose floor you're standing on right now." Nobody in the room understood what he meant yet. Certainly Wade didn't. He raised the knife another inch, jaw tight, and that was the exact moment the front window filled with headlights that had no business being that close together, that many, that fast. Carol didn't turn to look. She'd been expecting them for 6 minutes. To understand why 300 men were already less than a mile from that shop before Wade Tanner ever kicked open the door, you have to go back a long way further than that afternoon. The morning it happened had started like any other. Sadie had come in at 8:30, run the autoclave, and set out 3 appointment cards for the day. Carol arrived a little after 9, coffee in hand, and mentioned almost in passing that she needed to reorder black ink before the weekend.
Neither of them had any reason to think that day would end with 300 motorcycles parked outside their front window. Ashford Hollow, Ohio, is the kind of town most people drive through without remembering the name of it. One traffic light, a hardware store that still had the same owner it had 30 years earlier, a diner on Route 9 that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon and nothing after, and on the corner of Delancey Street, a narrow brick building with a hand-painted sign that read Iron Wing Inc., open 6 days a week, closed Sundays, no exceptions. Carol Dunmore had owned that shop for 41 years. She'd taken it over from her husband Frank Dunmore the year he died, and she had never once considered selling it, moving it, or renaming it, no matter how many younger artists came through town with cleaner equipment and louder opinions about how tattooing was supposed to be done now. She opened at 9. She swept the floor herself before any client walked in. She kept a photograph of Frank on a shelf behind the counter, faded at the edges, next to a coffee can full of old, worn-down needles she never threw away. The shop itself hadn't changed much since Frank's day. 2 chairs, a small waiting bench by the window, walls covered floor to ceiling in flash art. Some customers had picked from, and some had walked past entirely, coming in already knowing exactly what they wanted inked into their skin and why. A single motorcycle helmet sat on a high shelf behind the register, dusty, untouched, the only piece of the old life Carol had never been able to bring herself to pack away. Regular customers knew not to ask about the helmet. New customers usually noticed it, glanced at Carol, and decided against asking anyway. There was something about the way she moved through that shop that made most people trust her instincts about what deserved a question and what didn't. Sadie Coleman had walked into that shop 8 months ago looking for a job, any job, the kind of desperate that doesn't hide well no matter how a person tries to dress it up. Her mother, Diane, had been sick for going on 2 years, the kind of sick that eats a family's savings, a hospital bill at a time. And when the medical debt collectors sold what they were owed to a company called Bramwell Lending, Bramwell had gone looking for Diane's daughter's wages the way water finds a crack in a foundation. Carol had hired her that same afternoon, no experience required, told her the trade could be taught, but the patience for people's skin couldn't, and that Sadie already had more of the second thing than most people twice her age. She never asked Sadie about the debt. She didn't need to. She recognized the particular quiet of somebody carrying something too heavy to put down in front of other people, because she had carried something like it herself, once a long time before Sadie was born. Most mornings looked the same. Sadie arrived first, unlocked the front door, ran hot water through the autoclave, and set out the day's appointment cards on the counter beside the register. Carol came in around 9:30, coffee in one hand, the other resting on the door frame for just a second longer than it needed to, the way people do when a doorway has meant something to them for longer than anyone watching would guess. They didn't talk much while they worked. Carol wasn't a woman who filled silence for the sake of filling it, and Sadie had learned early that the quiet between them wasn't cold, it was companionable, the kind 2 people settle into once they've decided they don't need to perform anything for each other. Once, in her 4th month, Sadie had come in with her eyes swollen from crying in her car in the parking lot, and Carol hadn't asked what was wrong. She'd simply set a second cup of coffee on the counter, put on a pair of gloves, and said, "Hand me the black ink and tell me when you're ready to talk, or don't either way. This floor still needs sweeping." Sadie had told her eventually about the letter that had come that week from Bramwell Lending, the one with the number circled in red. Carol had listened without interrupting, finished the sentence she was inking, and only then said quietly that some debts get paid in dollars and some get paid in something else entirely, and the second kind mattered a great deal more in the long run than people like Bramwell Lending ever wanted anybody to believe. Sadie hadn't understood what she meant by that yet. Diane Coleman lived 2 towns over in a small rental house with a nurse who came by 3 times a week to help manage a heart condition that had eaten most of what the family had saved and a good deal that they hadn't. Sadie sent half of every paycheck straight to her mother's account without fail, and Bramwell Lending, once it acquired the medical debt from the hospital's collection agency, had made it very clear through 3 separate letters that half wasn't going to be enough for much longer. There was one afternoon, a few weeks before Wade Tainer ever pulled into Ashford Hollow, that Sadie would think back on often in the months after. A man in his 70s came into the shop asking for a memorial piece, a name and 2 dates, nothing elaborate, meant for a spot on his forearm where an old faded tattoo had worn thin with age. He hadn't asked for Sadie, he'd asked by name for Carol, in a voice that made it clear he'd been planning to ask for her specifically for a long time before he worked up the nerve to walk through the door.
Carol had worked on him in near silence for 2 hours, and when she finished, the old man had looked at his own arm for a long moment, then reached out and pressed Carol's hand between both of his, the way people do when a thank you feels too small for what they actually mean. He hadn't paid her. Carol hadn't asked him to. Sadie had swept up the floor around the chair after he left and asked, careful not to sound like she was prying, whether Carol always did work for free for men that age. Carol had only said that some accounts settled themselves eventually and gone back to cleaning her station without offering anything more. Sadie hadn't understood that answer either. Not yet. Stay with me here, because the reason 300 men would show up on Delancey Street inside of an hour goes back to a version of Carol Dunmore nobody in that tattoo shop had ever met. 43 years earlier, Carol wasn't the woman behind the counter. She was 19 years old working the register at her father's hardware store 2 towns over when a young writer named Frank Dunmore came through the door needing a bolt he couldn't find anywhere else in the county and instead found somebody he stayed for. Frank rode with a chapter out of Mill Race, Ohio. He was patient in a way most of the men he rode with weren't, and he taught Carol to hold a tattoo needle the same winter he taught her to ride in the back room of a garage that belonged to Otis Pruitt, who ran the Mill Race chapter at the time. She remembered the first night Frank put the machine in her hand like it had happened the week before instead of 4 decades earlier. He'd sat across from her at a folding table, his own forearm stretched flat in front of her, and told her the needle would only ever be as steady as the person holding it believed herself to be. You're not drawing on paper. You're putting something permanent into a person who trusts you not to shake. Most people never get trusted with anything like that in their whole lives. Don't waste it being scared. She hadn't been scared, not that night, and not many nights after it. She was good at it immediately, in the quiet, unglamorous way that mattered more than talent. Steady hands, patience with pain, and instinct for exactly how much pressure a person could take before flinching. Within 3 years, she wasn't just Frank's girl who could draw. She was the only artist any chapter within 3 states trusted to ink an honor patch, the mark given to a member who had done something the club would never forget and never discuss outside its own walls. There is a rule in that world older than any single chapter, older than most of the men who carry it forward. An honor patch is not something you asked for. It is something earned in a moment nobody plans for, and inked by somebody the whole club trusts to keep the reason behind it exactly where it belongs, buried, permanent, and silent. For 19 years, that somebody was Carol Dunmore. She inked the patch on a man named Wyatt Cole after he pulled 2 children out of a burning house on a road nobody else stopped for.
She remembered his hands shaking harder from what he'd seen that night than from the needle itself, and she remembered telling him the same thing Frank had told her years earlier, passed down like something handed between generations, because it was. She inked one on Reyes after she rode through a blizzard to get insulin to a member's daughter who would not have lived until morning. Carol still remembered the woman walking into the garage that night, ice still melting off her jacket, saying almost nothing about what the ride had cost her, and Carol understanding, without being told, that some silences are their own kind of honor patch. Carol had been the one to answer the garage door that night, 2:30 in the morning, Frank already asleep in the next room. The woman standing outside could barely get the pharmacy bag out of her jacket, her fingers too stiff with cold to manage the zipper. Carol had taken it from her without a word, walked it down the road herself to the house where a 9-year-old girl was waiting with her father, and by the time she came back, the woman named Reyes was sitting on the garage floor, not crying, just breathing, the particular kind of breathing that comes after a person has spent the last 2 hours convinced they weren't going to make it in time. "You didn't have to come back and tell anybody," Carol had said. "Nobody would have known how bad that ride was if you didn't say." "I know," Reyes had said. "That's exactly why I'm telling you." Carol never forgot that sentence. She thought of it more often than she admitted to anyone on the morning she opened Iron Wing Ink and found herself standing a little longer than necessary with her hand on the doorframe. She inked one to Otis Pruitt himself the year before he died, for reasons the 5 chapters that grew out of his original one still don't discuss with outsiders. Otis sat still for 4 hours without a single complaint, and at the end of it he'd looked at his own reflection in a cracked side mirror propped against the wall and only said, "Good, now." It's true, Carol never asked him to explain what he meant. Some things people say when they're moved don't need explaining.
Pulled out of a car sinking into a flooded creek during a spring storm and walked away before anyone could get his name for the local paper. It took the chapter 3 months to even learn who had done it. When it finally tracked him down and asked what he wanted for it, Danny said he didn't want anything, that he hadn't done it to be thanked. Carol inked his patch anyway 3 weeks later and told him that the whole point of an honor patch was that it wasn't for him. It was so that everyone who saw it on his back for the rest of his life would know without him ever having to say a word exactly what kind of man they were looking at. Danny wore that patch for 30 years before Carol ever needed to call in a single favor from anyone connected to it. She hadn't kept count of how many of them there were. She'd stopped needing to a long time ago. Frank died on a Tuesday morning in the garage behind their house, a wrench still in his hand and half a carburetor taken apart on the workbench in front of him. Carol found him there when he didn't come in for lunch. She didn't call anyone for 11 minutes. She simply sat down on the concrete beside him and held his hand until it felt right to let the world know. By the time Frank died of a heart attack in his own garage 19 years ago, Carol had inked honor patches for members across what had become a 5-chapter alliance, stretching through Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Every single one of those men understood something simple about her, whether they'd met her once or 100 times. They owed her. Not money, something a debt collector could never put a number on. She closed that chapter of her life the year Frank died, put the patches and the old ledger of names into a locked drawer beneath the register, and told herself the shop from now on would just be a shop, ink for anybody who walked through the door, no questions, no history, no reason for 300 grown men to ever need to remember her name again. She kept that promise to herself for 19 years. Stay with me, because the day that promise broke started somewhere Carol never saw coming, in a rented office 40 minutes away, where a 30-year-old man named Wade Tanner sat across a desk from his supervisor at Bramwell Lending, being told for the 3rd month running that his numbers weren't where they needed to be. Wade had grown up the way a lot of people in his position had, moved through 5 different foster placements by the time he was 14, never in one house long enough to learn whether anybody meant it when they said they'd keep him. He'd learned early that promises were a currency other people spent freely and never had to pay back. By the time he was an adult, he'd stopped expecting anyone to stay and started making sure people had no choice but to listen to him instead. He remembered one placement in particular, a house outside Dayton, where a foster mother had promised him on his 11th birthday that he'd be there through high school. She'd meant it,
probably, in the moment she said it. 7 months later, a caseworker's car pulled into that driveway anyway, and Wade sat in the back seat with a single duffel bag, watching the house get smaller through the rear window, and made himself a private promise instead. Nobody was ever going to move him without his say-so. He would be the one holding the leash from now on, not the one on the end of it. That promise took him through a string of jobs that all amounted to the same basic transaction: apply pressure, watch people comply, feel for a few minutes at a time like the ground under his feet finally belonged to him. Bramwell Lending had simply been the version of that transaction that paid the best. Collections work suited that part of him. He wasn't cruel for pleasure, he told himself most nights, that he was simply doing what the world had always done to him, only doing it first, doing it on purpose, doing it with a number attached so it felt like business instead of what it actually was. His supervisor, a man named Gary Holt, who kept a small motivational sign on his desk that read, "Results speak louder," slid the Coleman file across the desk that afternoon and tapped it twice with 2 fingers. "This one's been open 90 days too long," Gary said. "I don't care how you close it. I care that it's closed by Friday." "The daughter's an apprentice at some tattoo place," Wade said. "She doesn't make enough to matter." "Then make her matter," Gary said. "Get a garnishment signed. Doesn't have to be legal tight, just has to scare her enough that she doesn't fight it in court. You've done it before." Wade had done it before, 3 times in fact over the previous year, each one a little further past the line than the one before it, each one written up afterward in language soft enough that nobody above Gary Holt ever had to know exactly what firm pressure looked like in practice. Wade had told himself driving out of that parking lot that afternoon that this account would be the same as the others: scare tactics, a signature, a drive back to the office by dinner. He had no way of knowing that the daughter he was going to scare worked for a woman who could still, all these years later, empty a room just by walking into it. Diane Coleman didn't have the money, everyone at Bramwell already knew that. What they wanted instead was the daughter's signature on a wage garnishment, and Wade decided driving toward Ashford Hollow that afternoon that he would be the one who got it, whatever that took. Wade brought 2 men with him that afternoon, both of them younger than he was, both of them hired through a temp agency.
Bramwell used when a collection needed what the company's paperwork called additional physical presence. Neither of them asked many questions. Wade had learned that the less specific he was about what additional physical presence might require, the less likely either of them was to say no. He parked half a block down from Iron Wing Inc. and sat in the car for a minute, watching a young woman through the front window, bent over a client's arm, focused entirely on her work, no idea yet that the next 20 minutes were about to be the worst of her life. An old woman moved past the window behind her, unhurried, carrying a cup of coffee back to a chair by the glass. He barely registered her. Just an employee, probably. Somebody's mother killing time in a shop that wasn't hers. He had no idea the tattoo shop he was driving toward belonged to anybody but a stranger who cut hair with a different kind of machine. He had no idea that 40 minutes away, at a rented field outside of Millrace, close to 300 members from 5 chapters were gathering that same afternoon for the annual memorial ride honoring Otis Pruitt, the man who had built the alliance Carol Dunmore once had been trusted inside of. And he had no idea that the first phone call Carol made, the moment Wade Tanner pulled that knife on her apprentice, would reach a man less than a mile from that gathering. A man who had worn one of her honor patches on his back for over 20 years. The call lasted 4 words: Iron Wing, now. That was all Frank's oldest riding partner, a 69-year-old man named Marcus Reyes, the current president of the 5-chapter alliance, and the son of the woman Carol had once ridden through a blizzard's worth of debt to help, needed to hear. He didn't ask questions. He turned to the field behind him, where 300 engines sat cooling after the memorial ride, and said 5 words of his own: Iron Wing, now, all of you. Back on Delancey Street, Wade Tanner stood with his knife raised an inch too high, staring at Earl Whitfield's scarred knuckles, still not understanding what the old man meant when he said whose floor he was standing on. The headlights outside the window answered the question for him. Stay with me here, because what happened on Delancey Street over the next 90 seconds was the kind of thing people in that town would still be describing to each other years later, each version slightly different, none of them exaggerated by much.
The first bike came to a stop directly in front of Iron Ming Inc., engine cutting to silence in a way that felt louder than the noise it replaced. Then a second, then more than Wade could count without turning his head, more than fit along one block, more than his mind wanted to accept as real numbers rather than an exaggeration his eyes were making up. They didn't rush the door. That was the detail that unsettled Wade more than anything else. 300 men, and not one of them ran. They parked in rows with the unhurried precision of people who had done this exact thing in some form more times than they could count. Engines dying in overlapping waves until the only sound left on Delancey Street was Wade's own breathing and the distant tick of cooling metal outside. You have to wonder what you would have done standing in Wade Tanner's boots at that exact second. 300 engines gone silent outside a window you can't stop looking at, a knife suddenly feeling like the wrong thing to be holding, and no way to walk backward out of a decision you made 30 seconds ago. Marcus Reyes walked through the door first, 69 years old, built lean rather than large, the kind of frame that had spent 40 years earning respect through steadiness rather than size. Vest worn soft with age, patch on the front reading President, patch on the back that Wade never got a clear look at because Marcus never turned around. While Wade was still standing, Earl Whitfield hadn't said much else since Wade told him to sit back down. Only Carol and a handful of the oldest riders in that alliance knew that Earl had ridden with Otis Pruitt's chapter for 30 years before his knees gave out and he traded a bike for a recliner and a standing Tuesday tattoo appointment he didn't actually need, just an excuse to sit in a room that still felt like home. He hadn't worn a vest into that shop that afternoon. He hadn't needed to. Some men don't require the patch to still be exactly who the patch made them. He looked at Carol. He looked at the knife in Wade's hand. He looked at Sadie still on the floor, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "Carol," he said, quiet, almost gentle, like the 300 men filling the street behind him were an afterthought instead of the point. "You all right?" "I am now," Carol said. Marcus turned to Wade Tanner for the first time. He didn't raise his voice either. Whatever Wade had expected, shouting, threats, something loud enough to match the size of what had just arrived, didn't come. Instead, Marcus said 4 words, flat and final, the kind of sentence that didn't need volume behind it to land. "You're done here, son." Wade's knife hand had started shaking before Marcus finished the sentence. He looked past Marcus through the window at a street that had gone from empty to solid with parked motorcycles in less time than it had taken him to drag Sadie out of that chair. He looked at his 2 men, both already backing toward the rear exit, already deciding this job wasn't worth whatever Bramwell Lending was paying him. He had one real chance in that moment, same as Carol had given him minutes earlier. Set the knife down, walk out, let this become a story he never told anyone at the office.
A smarter man takes that chance and spends the rest of his life grateful nobody ever brings it up again. Wade Tanner was not, in that moment, a smarter man. "This isn't over," he said, pointing the knife at Carol, like the number of men outside hadn't changed anything about who he still thought he was. "That account gets closed one way or—" He didn't finish the sentence. As Earl Whitfield's hand closed around Wade's wrist from the side, calm as a man correcting a grandson's grip on a fishing rod, and the knife came free and clattered against the floor tile before Wade understood his fingers had let go of it. The 2 men Wade had brought with him hadn't waited around to see how the conversation ended. One of them had already backed out through the rear door the moment the headlights hit the front window, telling the other, in a voice that carried further than he probably intended, that the temp agency had never mentioned anything like this being part of the job. Nobody hit him. Nobody needed to. 300 men standing outside a tattoo shop window did more than empty a man's confidence than any single blow could have managed. And by the time the first police cruiser turned onto Delancey Street 6 minutes later, Wade Tanner was sitting on the curb outside his own car, head in his hands, while a deputy took down a report, surrounded by more motorcycles than the department had seen parked on one block in a decade. Sadie finally stood up off the floor while the deputy took Wade's statement, Carol's hand steady under her elbow the whole way up.
She didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there in the doorway of her own workplace, watching 300 strangers stand quietly outside a window that almost was the last thing she ever looked at from her knees. "I didn't know," Sadie finally said, voice still unsteady, "about any of it, the patches, the chapters, all of it." "Most people don't," Carol said. "That's rather the point of it." The stranger sitting in the second chair that afternoon, the one with half a tattoo still bleeding on his arm, gave his own statement to police later that night. He said he'd come into Ashford Hollow for nothing more than a piece of ink he'd been putting off for 2 years, and instead watched a woman half his age get dragged to the floor over a debt that had nothing to do with her, and then watched 300 strangers arrive to make sure it never happened to her again. He said he didn't have the words for what that was, only that he'd never forget it, and that he came back 6 months later to finish the piece Carol had set aside that day, insisting on paying full price even though Carol tried twice to wave him off. Officer Renee Colton grew up in Ashford Hollow. She knew Carol Dunmore the way most of the town did, as the quiet woman who ran the tattoo shop and kept mostly to herself. She did not know until Marcus Reyes explained it to her in careful, unhurried sentences on the sidewalk that evening exactly how many men in 3 states considered themselves in Carol's debt. She wrote her report the same way she would have written it for anyone: assault, attempted coercion, unlawful debt collection practices, a phrase that would matter a great deal in the weeks that followed, once investigators started pulling Bramwell Lending's file on the Coleman account and found Wade Tanner was not the first collector the company had sent out with instructions that stopped just short of the word violence and sometimes didn't stop there at all. Wade Tanner was arrested that night. He did not resist. The trial 5 months later lasted 2 days in a county courthouse that still had its original wooden benches worn smooth by decades of people waiting to hear whether their lives were about to change. Sadie sat in the second row every day. Carol sat beside her, hands folded, saying little, present, the way she was present for most things, quietly and without needing anyone to notice. Officer Renee Colton testified first, walking the jury through the report she'd written that night on Delancey. She described the garnishment document found on the shop floor, the needle Wade had held near Sadie's face, and the marks it had left on the concrete where he dropped it. She did not exaggerate anything. She didn't need to. Sadie testified on the first afternoon. Her voice shook through the first 2 questions and steadied after that, the way voices tend to rise once a person realizes the worst part of retelling something is usually the beginning of it, not the middle. She described the weight of Wade's hand in her hair, the heat of the needle motor near her cheek, and the particular helplessness of being told to sign away part of her income by a man who'd never once asked what the debt was actually for or whose life it belonged to. Wade's public defender argued what was true, that Bramwell Lending had trained its collectors to escalate, that Wade had been one man following orders inside a system built to squeeze desperate people until something gave. Financial records entered into evidence showed Wade's monthly quota and a training memo initialed by 3 separate supervisors that used the word firm pressure 4 times on a single page, without once mentioning where firm pressure was supposed to stop. It was true, and it did not undo what he'd done with his own hands to a woman on her knees on a concrete floor. Wade was sentenced to 18 months with the possibility of an earlier release contingent on completed anger management and financial ethics counseling. Bramwell Lending's collection license was suspended pending a state investigation that, by the time this story is being told, had already resulted in 2 more former employees coming forward with accounts nobody at the company wanted made public.
One of them, a former collector named Priya Marsh, who had worked 2 desks down from Wade for nearly 3 years, told investigators that the training memo entered into evidence was only the beginning of what new hires were taught in their first month. She described a whiteboard in the back office, updated weekly, ranking collectors by how quickly they closed accounts, with no distinction made between accounts closed through payment plans and accounts closed through the kind of pressure that ended on at least one occasion before Wade's, with a different collector facing his own set of charges. The company settled out of court quietly. Bramwell Lending's founder issued a single public statement through a lawyer expressing regret for what he called isolated conduct by individual employees. The state's investigators used different language in their filing. They called it policy. Sadie sat in the courtroom every day of that trial. On the second day, before sentencing, Wade Tanner turned around in his chair, looked at her directly for the first time since the day at the shop, and said something nobody in that courtroom had expected to hear from him. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not because I got caught, because of what I did to make you feel like you didn't have a choice. Nobody should ever have to feel that on their knees in front of people who care about them. I know what it is not to have anybody stay. I used it as an excuse to make sure people stayed scared of me instead. That's on me, all of it, start to finish. Your mother's debt was never yours to be punished for, and it was never mine to punish you over either." It wasn't a defense. It wasn't offered as one. Sadie didn't answer him, and she didn't owe him an answer, but she did, for the first time since that afternoon, let herself cry in a way that had nothing left in it of fear. Diane Coleman heard about what had happened on Delancey Street from a neighbor before Sadie ever had the chance to call her herself. She showed up at the shop 2 days later, still weak from her last hospital stay, and hugged her daughter for so long that Carol finally had to remind them both gently that there was a client waiting. "I didn't know you were carrying all that alone," Diane told Sadie once she'd caught her breath. "The debt, the letters, any of it." "I didn't want you carrying it too," Sadie said. "You had enough." Diane looked at Carol for a long moment, the way people look at someone they've just realized they owe them more than a simple thank you. Carol only nodded once, the way she did when a conversation had said everything it needed to say, and went back to setting up her station for the next appointment. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. When the foreman read the verdict, guilty on all 3 counts, Wade Tanner didn't react much at all, as though some part of him had already accepted the outcome the moment he'd watched the first headlights swing onto Delancey Street months earlier. Carol Dunmore was not required to testify, but she asked. She told the court plainly that she had spent 19 years trying to leave a part of her life behind the counter of that shop, locked in a drawer she told herself she'd never open again. She said she did not regret opening it. She said the world was full of people like Wade Tanner, made hard by things that happened to them before they were old enough to have any say in it, and that hardness was not an excuse, but it was sometimes an explanation worth understanding, if it meant fewer people ended up on either side of a knee on a concrete floor. "Respect," she told the courtroom, "isn't something you're owed because you're strong enough to take it. It's something you earn by knowing exactly when not to use whatever strength you've got." She looked briefly at Wade Tanner while she said it, not with anger, more with the particular tiredness of a woman who had spent 40 years watching fear pass from one frightened person to another, each of them convinced they were the exception. Wade didn't look away. A few jurors would later say that was the moment they stopped seeing 2 separate stories in that courtroom, a victim's and a defendant's, and started seeing one story about what happens when nobody ever teaches a person there's another way to matter besides being the one everybody's afraid of. The week after the trial ended, Marcus Reyes rode back into Ashford Hollow alone. No escort, no engines trailing behind him. He found Carol sweeping the front step of Iron Wing Inc. and stood there a moment before she noticed. "You didn't have to send 300, Carol said, not quite a complaint. "You didn't ask for 300, Marcus said. "You asked for help. My father used to say, a debt like the one this town owes you doesn't get repaid a little at a time. It gets repaid all at once, or it doesn't get repaid honestly at all." Carol didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't offer one. She went back to sweeping, and Marcus stood with her a while longer before riding off, and neither of them ever spoke of that day in quite so many words again. Some debts, once settled, are better left where they landed. 3 years passed. Sadie Coleman finished her apprenticeship the spring after the trial and stayed on at Iron Wing Inc.,
first as an artist, then as Carol's hands began to slow with age, as the person who opened the shop most mornings and swept the floor before the first client walked in. The first tattoo.
The only tattoo Sadie ever completed entirely on her own, 6 months after the trial ended, was a small compass on the inside of a young mother's wrist to mark the day she'd finally left an unsafe relationship for good. Sadie's hands hadn't shaken once through the whole 2 hours, and when Carol had finished, she looked at the line work for a long moment before saying only that Frank would have approved of the steadiness, which was coming from Carol, close to the highest praise Sadie had ever received from anyone. She learned gradually the rest of what Carol never explained outright. She learned it the way Carol had learned it from Frank, not through a single conversation, but through years of small moments accumulating into understanding. She learned why certain older riders came in asking for Carol by name and left without paying. She learned why a locked drawer beneath the register held an old ledger Carol never opened in front of customers, and why on the anniversary of Otis Pruitt's death each year, a handful of gray-haired men rode into Ashford Hollow just to sit in the shop for an hour and say almost nothing at all. Diane Coleman's medical debt was eventually resolved through a settlement tied to the Bramwell lending investigation, one of 11 households in 3 counties who received restitution once the state finished its case. Diane's heart condition remained, but the particular weight of owing money to people who used fear as a collection tool did not, and Sadie noticed in the months after that her mother laughed more easily than she had in longer than Sadie could remember. Carol still comes in most days, mostly to sit in the chair by the window with a cup of coffee and correct Sadie's line work when nobody's looking, though she rarely needs to anymore. The photograph of Frank still sits on the shelf behind the counter. The coffee can of old needles is still there beside it, and next to it now, in a small frame, Sadie added without asking permission, sits a photograph from the night 300 motorcycles filled Delancey Street, every rider standing in respectful, unposed silence in front of a shop that most of them had never had a reason to visit before, and every one of them glad in the end that they had. Last spring, a 17-year-old girl from 2 towns over started coming by after school, sweeping floors for a few dollars an hour, and asking careful questions about the machines. Sadie recognized the particular quiet in her almost immediately, the kind that comes from carrying something too heavy to set down in front of other people. And she didn't ask what it was. She simply handed the girl a broom, told her the trade could be taught, but the patience for people's skin couldn't, and said the girl already had more of the second thing than most people twice her age. Carol, sitting in the chair by the window, watched the whole exchange over the rim of her coffee cup and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. Some things get passed down, whether you explain them out loud or not. Wade Tanner served 14 months before his release, completed the counseling the court required, and took a job at a warehouse 2 counties away, a job with no accounts to close and no quotas measuring how much fear he could extract from another person's week. He sent one letter to Iron Wing Inc. the year after his release, addressed to Sadie, apologizing briefly and telling her he understood if she never wanted to read another word from him. Sadie read it once, folded it, and put it in a drawer. She never wrote back, and she never needed to. Some apologies do their work simply by existing. Word of what happened on Delancey Street moved through Ashford Hollow the way news moves through a town with one traffic light, fast and through the diner first. By the next morning, the hardware store owner had heard 4 different versions. The nurse who cared for Diane Coleman had heard 2 more, and most of them agreed on the one detail that mattered most. 300 men had come because one woman made a single phone call, and every one of them had come because they owed her something money couldn't touch. Nobody in town looked at Carol Dunmore differently after that. Not exactly. She still opened at 9. She still swept the floor herself before the first client walked in. But people said her name a little more carefully after that week. The way you say a name once you understand it carries more weight than you'd guessed. If you or someone you know is being threatened or harassed by a debt collector, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is at consumerfinance.gov. You have rights. You can file a complaint and someone will answer. People talk about strength like it's loud, like it announces itself, engines and all. Sometimes it does. But the strength that actually holds a town together for 40 years usually looks like a quiet woman sweeping her own step, a needle set down gently instead of grabbed, a debt repaid not in dollars, but in showing up when it matters most. That's the kind of strength this story was always about. If this story stayed with you, tell me which moment hit you hardest. I read every comment. Not every debt in this world gets settled in a courtroom, and not every rescue arrives with headlights and engine noise. Sometimes it looks like a woman setting down a needle, a phone call that only needs 4 words, or a stranger deciding quietly that somebody else's dignity is worth more than his own convenience. That's the kind of story Heart Tales was built to tell. This is Heart Tales, new stories every week. Subscribe and stay close. There's always another story worth hearing.